Christians, I am continuing in the series that I'm doing on the book of Philippians. And I'm in chapter 1 of the book of Philippians. And I am continuing where I left off on verse 6, where Paul, the apostle, who is in jail, who is found to be writing this message or this letter of comfort to the Philippians. Imagine the person who is imprisoned providing comfort to those who are on the outside. And yet this is exactly what is happening with the Apostle Paul as he writes this letter to the church at Philippi. Now, I left off on the last message by expounding upon verse 6, where Paul says something very profound. He says that he being confident of this very thing, and then he cites what it is he is confident about. And that is that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it or will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Paul is assuring to the Philippians and to all believers that Christ, who began a good work in you, will perform it, that God will perform all that he has promised. God, who has performed a good work in you, will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Now, it's striking when you understand that Paul is in prison. Paul is in prison. And as I said, he is providing comfort to God's people, and these people are not in prison. And he assures them that he is confident of this very thing, that God, who has begun a good work in them, will complete it until the day of Christ. Now they have to be looking at Paul, some of them, and thinking, how is it that you, being in prison, can be so confident that God is going to perform all these great things for and within us until the day of Jesus Christ? And yet, this is exactly what is happening. Exactly what is happening. And as I said before, I want to reiterate now, because this verse is of profound importance to us as believers to know, number one, that the work of God in us started with God and not with us. So many of you have got problems with this. You think that your salvation, so many of you believe that your salvation is the result of something you did, something you realized, something you rationalized, or something that you reasoned within yourself. Not knowing that your ability to come to faith has to do with a work of God that began with God in you and not with you. It began with God, who is working in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. It is God who works in you to frame and shape your will to do his will, to desire to do his will. And it is God who works in you not only to will, but to do of his good pleasure. So it is God who works in you to will and to do those things which do please him, starting with believing in his Son by faith. That is something that God does within you. You don't do anything other than act passively as a passive recipient and receiving the grace of God who works in you to do his good pleasure. From A to Z, your salvation is a work of God. Anyone who makes a study of the doctrine of soteriology, which is the doctrine of salvation, if you can study this particular subject and not conclude that man is absent when it comes to salvation and into embracing the means of grace, you have misunderstood the whole methodology, the whole modus operandi of salvation. It's very simple. Salvation had nothing to do with you. If you have salvation, every true believer knows, if not by understanding, but in practice, they know that salvation is completely a work of God in you. And if God begun that work in you, having been the one to have begun that work in you, he has assured us that he will perform it until the day of Christ. Which means, Christians, there is no possible way for you as a believer to ever lose what God has given you, because he gave it to you and he will perform it until the day of Christ. That is in verse 6 of chapter 1 in the book of Philippians. Paul says he is confident that God, who has begun the work in you, will perform it until the day of Christ. There is no room for error. There is no room for you to fall away from the clutches of God and his Son. That is an absolute impossibility. Verse 7, Paul says, just as it is right for me to think of you all, to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are all partakers with me of grace. Paul acknowledges to the Philippians that they are recipients and partakers in the gospel with him in grace. And Paul did not slice and dice people up and say things like, well, if you don't hold this way or act this way or become this way or see things my way, then you're not a Christian or not a believer or not a partaker with him in grace. Paul understands that there is a process whereby everyone who is a Christian is expected to learn and to grow, and we all learn and grow at different paces. We all learn and grow, and we all enter into different stages of the Christian faith, and we should be careful to dismiss anyone who doesn't see things or understand things the way we do. I can say this with full confidence and assurance because there have been many times in my life, especially as a young Christian, where I can recall being the very person I am now saying we should not be. One who makes judgments and assessments about people's salvation because they don't yet understand the way that I do, or they don't see things the way I do. Now, granted, there are many things that you cannot believe and call yourself a Christian. There are many things. But I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about things which the Bible would deem as things that are indifferent. Things that are, in the Greek, would be referred to as adiaphora. Things indifferent. So we need to be careful of this because people are learning at different stages. Most of you